The first ancient Olympic Games can be traced back to 776 BC. They were dedicated to the Olympian gods and were staged on the ancient plains of Olympia. All free male Greek citizens were entitled to participate. Married women were not allowed to participate in or to watch the ancient Olympic Games. However, unmarried women could attend the competition, and the priestess of Demeter, goddess of fertility, was given a privileged position next to the stadium altar. Throughout the 12 centuries of the Olympic Games, many athletes competed in the stadium and the hippodrome of ancient Olympia's sacred area. Although the athletes were mortal, their Olympic victories made them immortal. The ancient Olympic Games were initially a one-day event until 684 BC, when they were extended to 3 days. In the 5th century BC, the Games were extended again to cover 5 days. The ancient games included running, long jump, shot put, javelin, boxing, pangration, a combination of boxing and wrestling, and equestrian events. The ancient Olympic Games were closely linked to the religious festivals of the cult of Zeus, but were not an integral part of a rite. They aimed to show the physical qualities and evolution of the performances accomplished by young people, as well as to encourage good relations between the cities of Greece. The Olympic victor received his first awards immediately after the competition. The herald would announce the winner's name, then place a palm branch in his hands, while the spectators cheered and threw flowers to him. Red ribbons were tied on the winner's head and hands as a mark of victory. The official award ceremony would take place on the last day of the Games, at the elevated vestibule of the Temple of Zeus. In a loud voice, the herald would announce the name of the Olympic winner, his father's name, and his homeland, then place the sacred olive tree wreath, or kotinos, on the winner's head. The Games continued for nearly 12 centuries until 393 AD, when Emperor Theodosius decreed that all such pagan cults be banned. Flash forward to 1894, when at the urging of Baron Pierre de Coubertin, the International Olympic Committee, known as the IOC, was founded. The first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, Greece in 1896. 14 countries were represented by about 245 athletes, competing in 43 events. In keeping with the ancient tradition, no women competed. Apparently, Baron de Coubertin felt that their inclusion would be impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and incorrect. The role of the IOC, according to the Olympic Charter, includes dedication to the promotion of ethics in sport, the promotion of world peace, the action against any form of discrimination affecting the Olympic movement, the support and promotion of women in sport, and the equality of men and women, the encouragement and support of measures protecting the health of athletes, including a leadership role in the fight against doping in sport, the responsible concern for the environment, the support of a positive legacy from the Games to the host cities and countries, and the support of initiatives that blend culture and education. In spite of the mission to peacefully include members of all cultures in sport and friendly nonviolent competition, the Olympic Games have been repeatedly tainted with controversy and violence, and conflicts with Mother Nature throughout its modern history. The second modern Games were overshadowed by and incorporated into the Paris Exposition. 1,319 men from 26 countries competed in 75 events, although it was not entirely clear, even to some of the participants, which events were actually part of the Olympics. This time, however, 11 women were allowed to compete in lawn tennis and golf. For 2 consecutive Games, in 1904 and in 1908, controversy surrounded the marathon event. In 1904, after one runner was disqualified for using performance-enhancing drugs, it was discovered that the marathon winner Fred Lourdes actually rode in a car for 11 miles of the race. In 1908, Italian runner Dorando Pietri needed to be helped across the finish line and was declared the winner before being disqualified in favor of Johnny Hayes of the United States. London first hosted the official Olympic Games in 1908, after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1906 forced the Games to move to London from Rome. It was during the 1908 Olympics that the athletes marched into the stadium behind their nation's flags for the first time. There were more than 2,000 competitors in more than 100 events. It was in 1912 at the Stockholm Games that American Jim Thorpe dominated, taking the gold in the pentathlon and decathlon. Jim Thorpe's medals were taken away and his name removed from the record books in 1913, when it was discovered that he was paid $25 a week for playing baseball in 1909 and 1910. The IOC determined that Thorpe's baseball experience adversely affected his amateur status in track and field events. The Olympics were at the time strictly limited to amateur players. The IOC explains that an amateur is one who devotes himself to sport for sport's sake, without deriving from it, directly or indirectly, the means of existence. A professional is one who derives the means of existence entirely or partly from sport. In 1925, the IOC officially forbade such practices as compensating athletes for time taken away from work to compete, making it difficult for working-class athletes to participate. This regulation prompted future banning of athletes due to viewed overcompensation for travel expenses and other questionable accounting practices. The ban also prompted the creation of world athletic events, including the World Cup, which was first held in 1930 in response to the IOC's ban on professional athletes. Jim Thorpe was officially pardoned in 1982, 29 years after his death. The IOC then lifted its ban of professional athletes, allowing international sports federations the right to determine which athletes may compete, provided they live up to the standards of the Olympic Charter, and do not receive money during the Games for either competing or for winning. The Olympic Games were not held in 1916 due to World War I. When the Games resumed in Antwerp in 1920, the Olympic flag and the Olympic oath were introduced. However, Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Turkey were not invited to the 1920 Games, having been on the wrong side of the Great War. Germany was again snubbed in 1924 because of its involvement in World War I, but the other 4 countries were invited to participate and send teams. Also in 1924, Chamonix hosted its Winter Classic, which would later be given the title as the first Winter Olympic Games. The next Winter Games in 1928 in St. were plagued by warm weather, which slowed the progression of some events and forced the cancellation of the 10,000-meter speed skating race. During future Winter Games, snow has been transported to the Olympic venues, and since the 1980s, artificial snow is made when necessary. After the Berlin Summer Games of 1936, during which American Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals, showing up German claims of Aryan superiority, the Games were not held in 1940 or in 1944 due to World War II. In 1948, the Games resumed again in London, and were the first to be shown on home television. Because of their involvement in World War II, Germany and Japan were not invited, but a record 59 other countries attended. Soviet athletes competed in the Olympics for the first time in 40 years, beginning in 1952. These games marked the beginning of a medal count rivalry between the USSR and the USA. In this competition, the United States just barely edged out the Soviet Union with a medal count of 76 to 71. In 1956, athletes from all nations entered the stadium in unity for the closing ceremonies rather than marching in by nation. Also in 1956, Germany was represented by a combined East and West German team. Unfortunately, not all nations were represented at the closing ceremonies. The countries of Liechtenstein, the Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden boycotted the Games in protest of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq did the same as a result of the Suez Crisis. The People's Republic of China refused to participate due to the inclusion of the Republic of China, also known as Taiwan. Boycotting games in protest of another country's political climate or practices became more frequent throughout the history of the Games, with Canada boycotting the Games in 1972 in protest of Eastern European state amateurs, and dozens of other nations, mostly African, boycotting the Games in 1976 in protest of the inclusion of New Zealand, whose rugby team was touring racially segregated South Africa. South Africa was banned from participating in the Olympic Games in 1964 due to its practice of apartheid, and was not invited back to the Games until 1992. The United States boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, the first games held in a communist country, in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets retaliated in 1984 when the Games were held in Los Angeles by leading a 14-nation boycott. The use of amphetamines by a Danish cyclist, which led to a fatal fall that fractured his skull during the 1960 Summer Games in Helsinki, prompted the IOC to introduce drug tests in 1964. In spite of testing, drug use still plagues the Olympic Games, most notably in Salt Lake City in 2002, when one Spanish and two Russian athletes tested positive for darbepoetin and were stripped of their medals, and Britain's Alain Baxter lost his bronze medal after using a Vicks inhaler, the formulation of which is different in the USA than it is in the UK. Baxter was later cleared of all moral guilt, but his medal was not returned. In 2007, track star Marion Jones was ordered by the International Athletics Association to return all medals and prize money and to forfeit all race results after pleading guilty to using performance-enhancing drugs and admitting to making false statements during two government drug investigations. Gender testing for female athletes was introduced in 1968 and continued until the 2002 Salt Lake City Winter Games. In spite of the message of peace, the Olympic Games has also been the scene of horrific acts against humanity, the most notably in 1972 in Munich, when members of the Black September terrorist group kidnapped 11 Israeli athletes from the Olympic Village. 2 athletes were killed and the other 9 taken hostage, and the terrorists demanded safe passage by plane out of Germany. The Germans staged an elaborate rescue attempt at the airfield, but failed. All of 9 of the Israeli athletes were killed, along with all but 3 of the terrorists. After much discussion, the Games continued after a day of mourning. Many Jewish athletes from other countries, including swimmer Mark Spitz, left the Games for their own safety. In Atlanta, in 1996, 1 person was killed and 11 injured by a pipe bomb planted by Eric Rudolph in Centennial Olympic Park. The Games continued uninterrupted. The road to the 2008 Olympics in Beijing was a difficult one. Initially, human rights activists and government officials proposed boycotting the 2008 Olympics in Beijing due to China's economic and military connections to Sudan, where more than 200,000 people have died and 2.5 million have been displaced by the civil war. Concern about Beijing hosting the Summer Olympics resurfaced in March 2008, after Chinese police violently cracked down on protests by ethnic Tibetans and Buddhist monks in Lhasa, Tibet. In April 2008, protests by human rights groups disrupted the Olympic torch progression to Beijing. Between March 26 and April 6, 2008, Chinese officials arrested 35 members of a criminal ring based in Xinjiang for plotting to kidnap Olympic athletes, journalists, and others. Police found at least 22 pounds of explosives and 8 sticks of dynamite during their raids. Violence and human rights issues aside, the air quality in Beijing was also a concern. While the concern during the Summer Games in Mexico City in 1968 was high altitude, in this case the air pollution was the issue, being in Beijing at least 2 to 3 times higher than levels considered safe by the World Health Organization. Medical research by the IOC showed that air pollution would put athletes at risk and could inhibit their performance. In an attempt to clear air pollution for the Summer Games, Chinese officials called a halt to construction work and quarrying, and enforced a 30% emissions reduction for power plants in and around Beijing, effective July 20, 2008. To make matters worse, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck in Sichuan, China on May 12, 2008. Somehow China managed to recover from the effects and host the Summer Games in August. The Chinese government allowed peaceful public demonstrations to be held in the city during the Games, provided the citizens participating were approved by the local Public Security Bureau 5 days before their intended protest. All in all, the 2008 Summer Games were considered a success, with the United States, China, and Russia taking home the most medals. The 2008 Summer Games closed, and Beijing handed over the hosting duties to London for the 2012 Summer Games. Plans for the London Games will be detailed later during the Westworld Games, when we return to these rooms for the indoor events.